History counts the dead, but it rarely counts the erased. In the chaos of war, millions of bodies fell, but something even quieter was happening, something harder to measure. Identities were disappearing. During World War I and World War II, entire communities were uprooted, renamed, and reclassified. Borders shifted overnight. A man could go to sleep in one country and wake up in another without ever moving. Languages were banned. Names were changed to fit new regimes. Children were separated from their families not always by bullets, but by policies. In places like Eastern Europe and the Ottoman territories, records were destroyed, rewritten, or never kept at all. Ethnic groups vanished not because every person died, but because their identity was stripped away piece by piece. A child taken in war could grow up speaking a different language, praying to a different god, never knowing their original name. And when the war ended, there was no grave to visit, no document to trace, no proof they ever existed as they once were. This is the side of war history rarely told. Not just death, but disappearance without dying. Call to action. If you value hidden history like this, subscribe, like, comment, and share, because some stories were meant to be forgotten. Because sometimes the greatest loss in war is not life, it's identity. War doesn't always change how you live. Sometimes it changes who you are, not through choice, but through force. During World War II, identity became something governments could erase and rebuild. In Nazi-occupied territories, names were stripped of their origins. Jewish families were forced to adopt imposed identities, numbers replacing names, records replacing memory. But the rewriting didn't end there. In Eastern Europe, entire populations were relocated under Soviet policies. Villages emptied, families scattered across thousands of miles. A child born Polish could grow up in Kazakhstan, speaking a different language, carrying a different history, taught to forget where they came from. This wasn't accidental, it was systematic. During the Holocaust, identity was targeted as much as life itself. Religion, language, culture, these were seen as threats. Erasing them was a form of control. If you could erase who someone was, you could reshape what they became. And children were the most vulnerable. Thousands were taken, re-educated, and placed into new families. Some were chosen for their appearance, blonde hair, blue eyes, absorbed into a new identity that aligned with Nazi ideology. Their past was not just forgotten, it was replaced. They were taught new names, new languages, new loyalties. By the time the war ended, many didn't remember who they had been. And even when survivors tried to return home, they faced another kind of loss. No records, no surviving relatives, no proof of origin. Imagine knowing you existed, but having no way to prove who you are. This is the quiet aftermath of war. Not the explosions, but the silence that follows, where identity becomes fragmented, like a cracked mirror. Some spent their entire lives searching for answers, tracing documents, following rumors, hoping to find a name that once belonged to them. Some never did, because war doesn't just destroy nations. It reshapes people from the inside out. It takes memory and replaces it. It takes identity and rewrites it. And long after the guns fall silent, that rewritten identity remains, a life lived as someone else. War leaves scars we can see, and scars we cannot. Among the most haunting are the children who vanished not from bullets, but from memory. In the shadows of conflict, governments and regimes found a cruel way to exert control by taking the young. The Lebensborn Program in Nazi Germany sought to breed a new generation. Children were taken from occupied territories or targeted families deemed racially valuable. They were placed with German families, renamed, and taught to forget their origins. Some children never saw their birth parents again. Their entire existence was rewritten to serve an ideology. Across the Atlantic and centuries apart, Indigenous children faced a similar, devastating fate. In Canada and the United States, residential schools separated children from their families, their communities, and their languages. These schools were not only educational institutions, they were tools of assimilation. Native children were forbidden from speaking their mother tongues, punished for practicing traditions, and forced to adopt new names. Generations grew up disconnected from their heritage, left with invisible wounds that would echo through decades. The common thread is clear. These children were taken not to die, but to become someone else entirely. They were given new names. They were forced to speak new languages. They were taught new beliefs, new loyalties, and a new identity. Some adapted to survive. Some resisted quietly. Many spent their entire lives searching for the selves that were stolen from them. The psychological impact was profound. A child's sense of belonging, essential for emotional development, was deliberately severed. These young victims were invisible in the historical record. Their suffering did not make headlines, yet it rippled through families, communities, and nations. And even when some returned to their original families, the reunion was bittersweet. A child who had grown up in another culture, speaking another language, could no longer fully fit into the life they once knew. The war had stolen more than their childhood. It had stolen continuity, heritage, and the most basic sense of self. This is the hidden side of conflict. Lives altered forever, not through death, but through erasure. Some of these children never reclaimed their original names. Some never reclaimed their languages. Some never reclaimed themselves. And that is why history must remember them not just as victims of war, but as victims of deliberate identity theft. Because the world counts the fallen, but it often forgets the disappeared. Maps are lines on paper until they are drawn in blood. When borders shift, they don't just redraw nations, they rewrite lives. The partition of India in 1947 is one of the most vivid examples. Overnight, the British Raj dissolved, and two nations, India and Pakistan, emerged. Cities that had been home to families for generations became foreign territory. Millions of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs were forced to flee, carrying what little they could, leaving behind ancestral homes, livelihoods, and the memory of centuries. Roads became rivers of humanity, with trains overcrowded, roads choked with families marching under fear, disease, and violence. One day, you belonged, the next, you were a stranger in your own land. Earlier, during World War I, the collapse of empires Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian created similar turmoil. Ethnic groups who had lived peacefully under imperial structures suddenly found themselves minorities in new countries, often under governments that saw them as outsiders. Borders shifted faster than identities could adapt. Citizenship became a legal label, not a sense of belonging. Families awoke to find their nationality had changed while they slept. The human cost is staggering. Property abandoned, communities uprooted, families scattered across newly drawn lines. Language, culture, and even personal names sometimes had to be changed to fit new bureaucracies or nationalist policies. The displacement was not only physical, it was emotional, cultural, and existential. These mass movements left scars that generations could not erase. Children grew up in foreign lands, learning new languages, new customs, and a new sense of self, while the memory of home became a distant, almost mythical place. History often counts borders and treaties, but the people who crossed them or who were left behind are rarely measured. They were the living proof that political decisions could uproot the soul of a nation. Some fled for survival, some were forced to march, and some simply vanished into the chaos. Their identities were not just disrupted, they were transformed against their will. The home they once knew existed only in memory, and even that was threatened by propaganda, nationalism, and time. Borders are more than lines. They are the invisible hands that shape human lives. When they change, people are not just relocated, they are reborn into uncertainty, into exile, into a world that no longer recognizes them. And in the echoes of these movements, we see a universal truth. The greatest casualty of shifting borders is not land, it is identity. To erase a people, you don't always need to destroy them. Sometimes, you only need to silence their words. Language is more than communication. It carries memory, identity, culture, an entire way of seeing the world. And in times of war and colonization, it is often the first target. During European colonial expansion across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, native languages were systematically suppressed. Colonial administrations imposed foreign tongues, English, French, Spanish, not just for governance, but for control. Speaking your native language became a sign of resistance, and sometimes a punishable act. In many schools, children were forced to abandon their mother tongues. They were taught to read, write, and think in a language that was not their own. Over time, something deeper than vocabulary was lost: the connection to ancestry, to oral traditions, to identity itself. This pattern repeated across history. In indigenous communities, especially in North America and Australia, children placed in state or church-run institutions were forbidden from speaking their native languages. Punishments ranged from humiliation to physical discipline. The goal was clear: erase the past to reshape the future. And it worked partially. Entire generations grew up unable to speak the language of their grandparents. Conversations between elders and children became fragmented. Stories that once passed through generations began to disappear. Words that had no direct translation in colonial languages, words tied to land, spirituality, and community, simply vanished. War accelerates this loss. When people are displaced, when families scatter across borders, language becomes fragile. A child growing up in exile adapts quickly, often abandoning their original tongue to survive in a new environment. What begins as adaptation becomes permanent loss. And once a language disappears, it rarely returns in its full form. Because language is not just words, it is rhythm, emotion, worldview. It is the sound of home. Imagine knowing your ancestors spoke a language you can no longer understand. Imagine hearing fragments of it, but never fully grasping what was lost. This is how identity fades, not in a single moment, but over generations, silently, gradually, irreversibly. Today, thousands of languages are endangered, many on the brink of extinction. And behind each one is a history of conquest, of war, of forced silence. Because when a language dies, a people don't just lose their voice, they lose a part of who they are. War doesn't just take your freedom, it tells you who you are allowed to be, not who you were born as, but who the system decides you should become. During the Cultural Revolution in China, identity itself became a battlefield. Citizens were no longer judged by personal history or family legacy, but by political classification. Labels like red or black determine your future, your job, your safety, even your right to exist without persecution. Children were taught to reject their parents if they were seen as enemies of the state. Loyalty was redirected from family to ideology. This wasn't just control, it was reconstruction. Across different regions and conflicts, forced assimilation followed a similar pattern. Ethnic groups were reclassified, renamed, and absorbed into dominant cultures. Governments rewrote identities through documentation, changing ethnic labels, suppressing traditions, and standardizing language and behavior. In some cases, entire communities were told they no longer existed as distinct people. Imagine being told your culture is invalid, your name is incorrect, your past is irrelevant, and the only way to survive is to accept a new version of yourself. This is the psychology of forced identity. It doesn't rely on chains. It relies on pressure, fear, and repetition. Schools became training grounds. Media became reinforcement. Public life became performance. People learned to speak carefully, act carefully, even think carefully. Because the danger was not just punishment, it was erasure. Over time, the lines between imposed identity and real identity began to blur. Some adapted completely, internalizing the new labels. Others lived double lives, one identity for survival, another hidden deep within. But both came at a cost, because identity is not just what you are called, it is what you believe about yourself. And when that is controlled, freedom becomes an illusion. The most disturbing part is this: forced identity often outlives the war or regime that created it. Long after policies end, the psychological impact remains. Generations inherit narratives that were constructed, not chosen. History becomes filtered through the lens of control, and truth becomes harder to recognize. This is how power reshapes people, not by destroying them, but by redefining them. So the question is no longer just what was taken, but what was replaced. Because when war tells you who you are, the hardest battle is remembering who you were. History is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is rewritten by them, not with ink alone, but with power. In times of war and political upheaval, controlling the past becomes just as important as controlling the present. Because if you can shape what people remember, you can shape what they believe. During the rise of Nazi Germany, books that challenged ideology were burned in public squares. Knowledge was not just suppressed, it was erased. What remained was carefully selected, edited to fit a narrative of superiority, control, and obedience. But this was not an isolated act. In the Cultural Revolution, China witnessed a systematic destruction of history. Ancient texts, cultural artifacts, even family records were targeted. The goal was clear: disconnect people from their past so they could be reshaped for the future. When history is removed, identity becomes easier to control. Even photographs were not safe. In the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, images were altered to remove individuals who had fallen out of favor. A man could stand beside a leader one day and be erased from the record the next. Official documents were revised, textbooks updated. The past itself became unstable, constantly shifting to match the present narrative. This is the power of edited history. It doesn't just hide facts, it replaces them. Generations grow up learning versions of events that never truly happened. Heroes are created, enemies are defined. Entire groups are written out of the story altogether, and over time, the rewritten version becomes accepted truth. The danger is not just misinformation, it is transformation. Because when people lose access to their real history, they lose the ability to question their reality. Memory becomes dependent on authority. Truth becomes whatever is allowed to survive, and those who remember differently are often silenced. This is how control extends beyond the battlefield, not through weapons, but through narrative. The burning of books, the editing of records, the rewriting of textbooks, these are not just acts of censorship. They are acts of reconstruction. They rebuild the past to control the future. So when you read history, the question is not just what happened, but what was removed. Because sometimes the most powerful part of history is what you were never told. War has changed its face, but not its impact. Today, battles are not only fought with bullets and bombs. They are fought with information, displacement, and control. And once again, identity is on the front line. In modern conflicts, entire populations are forced to flee their homes, not knowing if they will ever return. The Syrian civil war created one of the largest refugee crises in recent history. Millions crossed borders into unfamiliar countries, carrying fragments of their lives in small bags, documents, photographs, and memories. But identity does not travel easily. In refugee camps, generations grow up between worlds. Children learn new languages to survive, often faster than their parents. Over time, the language of home fades. Traditions become harder to practice. Culture becomes something remembered rather than lived, and the longer displacement lasts, the more identity begins to shift. This is not just migration, it is transformation under pressure. In conflicts like the Russo-Ukrainian War, the battle extends beyond territory. Information itself becomes a weapon. Narratives are shaped, histories are contested, and identities are influenced by what people are told to believe about themselves and others. Who you are can be redefined by what you hear repeatedly. Digital warfare amplifies this effect. Social media, news, and propaganda create competing realities. People living through the same conflict can emerge with completely different understandings of who they are, what they represent, and where they belong. At the same time, cultural erasure continues quietly. Historic sites destroyed, languages endangered, communities scattered, not always by design, but often as a consequence of prolonged instability. And when people are forced to rebuild their lives elsewhere, survival becomes the priority. Identity becomes secondary. A child born in exile may never see their homeland, may never speak the language fluently, may never fully understand the culture they come from. This is how identity fades in the modern world. Not suddenly, but gradually, through distance, through adaptation, through time. Yet, unlike the past, today's war leaves a digital footprint. Photos, videos, and voices survive online. But even this comes with a question. What is real, and what is shaped? Because in modern conflict, controlling identity is no longer just about removing the past. It is about overwhelming the present. So the battlefield has expanded from land to memory to perception, and the question remains the same as it has always been. When everything around you changes, how do you hold on to who you are? They survived, but survival is not the same as remaining whole. Across every conflict from World War I to World War II, from partitions to modern displacement, millions lived through the violence. They walked away from their own country, crossed borders, rebuilt homes, and raised families. But something invisible did not survive with them. Who were they? Before everything changed, before the language was silenced, before the name was altered, before the map redrew their place in the world. A farmer became a refugee. A child became a stranger to their own past. A family became a memory scattered across countries. History often tells us who people became after war: citizens, migrants, survivors. But it rarely pauses to ask who they were before the labels, before identity was rewritten by circumstance. In the aftermath of conflict, people adapt. They learn new languages, accept new documents, and live under new flags. On the surface, life continues. But beneath it, there is a quiet fracture. Memories that don't fully belong to the present. Names that no longer match official records. Traditions that feel distant, almost unfamiliar. Some try to hold on, preserving stories, passing down fragments of culture, holding tightly to what remains. Others let go, not by choice, but by necessity, because survival demands adaptation. And adaptation often comes at the cost of identity. Imagine remembering a childhood home you can never return to, a language you can no longer fully speak, a version of yourself that exists only in memory. This is the unseen weight carried by survivors. They are alive, but not unchanged, because war does not only destroy in the moment, it continues quietly, reshaping lives long after the fighting ends. And over time, the original identity fades, not completely, but enough to feel distant. Like a voice you once knew, but can no longer clearly hear. So when we look at history, at the survivors, at the millions who endured, we must ask a deeper question. Not just what happened to them, but what was lost within them. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy of war is not death, it is the slow, irreversible loss of self. To survive, but no longer fully recognize who you are. And in that silence, one question remains. Who were they before the war?